Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are around the globe. Nice to have you with us. My name is Eran Neumann. I am the Dean of the Yolanda David Katz Faculty of the Arts at Tel Aviv University, and I'm glad to open our fourth meeting in the second series of conversations between leading international scholars and intellectuals and our faculty members. We are honored to have with us today Professor Henry Jenkins of the University of Southern California, who will converse with Dr. Yael Levy from the Steve T. School of Film and Television in our faculty on film, protest, and democracy. Yael will introduce Professor Jenkins shortly. The title of the series is Art, Protest, and Democracy. In our four talks, and this is the fourth, last and not least talk, we explore the contentious debate about the role played by art, film, theater, architecture, and urbanism in preventing and defending democracy. And I think that the event that we saw last week on Capitol Hill and the Capitol building make it even more relevant, this talk. Well, over the past decades, we have witnessed changes in the ways in which democracy is conceptualized and practiced, and seen how these processes has led to the worrisome weakening of democracies around the world. Regimes in the Americas, Europe, and Asia have become more deeply nationalist and authoritarian, eroding democratic values and depriving people of the most basic human rights. Faced with global pandemic, the notion of democracy is being further challenged as leaders worldwide enforce restrictive new rules and regulation under the rubric of state of emergency, which accelerates and institutionalizes these processes. This situation raises numerous questions, including how should art, artists, and researchers respond to the assault on democracy? How does it affect art? What is the place of digital and social media in the arts and in substantiating democracy? Should and how can the arts participate in discussion of democracy today? And will it make any difference? I truly hope that we'll be able to shed some light on these important questions during the compelling conversation today. And actually, I'm sure that that's what's going to be. And now I'm happy to introduce Dr. Yael Levy. Yael Levy is a teaching fellow at the Steve T. School of Film and Television at Tel Aviv University. Her articles on gender, race, sexuality, and textuality in television have appeared in numerous journals, including Feminist Media Studies, Continuum, Journal of Media and Culture Studies, and more. She co-edited the book Israeli Television, Local Visions, Global Context with Miri Talmon. It came out on Routledge last year. And her book, Chick TV, Anti-Heroines and Time Unbound, is forthcoming this summer by Syracuse University Press. Yael, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Neumann, and thank you so much, Professor Jenkins, for joining us. I will also start by introducing Professor Jenkins, and then we can continue with our talk. So I'm excited and honored to present Professor Henry Jenkins, who is the Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, Cinematic Arts, and Education at the University of Southern California, and the founder and former co-director of the Comparative Media Studies program at MIT. He is the principal investigator for the MacArthur Foundation Civic Imagination Project and the author or co-author of 20 books on various aspects of new media and popular culture, including Textual Poachers, Television Fans and Participatory Culture, Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide, Participatory Culture in a Network Culture, By Any Media Necessary, The New Youth Activism in Popular Culture, and the Civic Imagination, Case Studies of Creative Social Change. He blogs regularly at henryjenkins.org and co-hosts the How Do You Like It So Far podcast. So thank you again, Professor Jenkins, for joining us. And I was initially very excited to conclude this fascinating series that we've had, the Arts Faculty Dean series about art, protest, and democracy, with a scholar who was criticized often for being overly optimistic about the democratizing potential of media fandom and participation. But I think that, as Professor Neumann mentioned, last week's events in DC have exposed how violent participation can be, and perhaps other sides of participation. So I would like to start with the questions that I wanted to address about fandom and activism, but maybe we can tap into these recent events. So I want to start with your earlier texts, Textual Poachers, Television Fans, and Participatory Culture, in which you discuss fandom as a gateway to activism, and in many ways as activism. And you address the Harry Potter Alliance, and later you also kind of mention K-pop fans and their achievements. But also, as I've mentioned about what had happened in DC last week, I've heard in your podcast that you and your guests referred to Trump as a product of fandom. And we also see QAnon fandom. So if you could elaborate on the concept of fandom leading to activism, and perhaps even more so than that, on fandom as activism, on maybe both sides of these of the political map and the more extremist sides of it.
Sure. And first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great honor to be speaking to Israel today. This is my first talk in your country. I hope someday to actually visit it face to face, but this is the second best thing. So I guess I will start with the concept of fan activism and try to circle back to the events of this past week in that context. The first place to start when thinking about fan activism is the way in which fandom is itself already social and civic, in that it brings groups of people together for important conversations. That one of the differences between fandom and quote ordinary viewing, there's never a good word to set up that distinction, but is that fans are social by nature. They reach out to other people who share their passions and interests. That watching television is the beginning of an activity, not the end of an activity. And that may be simply dialogue, or it may be social organization, but it also could be creative output, formalized expression, whether it's fan fiction, fan cosplay, fan music, fan bidding, many forms of expression. And that's centrally what Textual Poachers was about. The second is that it's about the imagination. And increasingly, my research group uses the term civic imagination to think about what role imagination plays with social change. So to begin with, before you can build a better world, you have to imagine what a better world looks like. That's the utopian dimension of the imagination. You have to see yourself as a civic agent capable of making change. And you might think about the poster for this talk, which has the young women dressed as Wonder Woman involved in an act of protest, and the sense of female empowerment that comes in adopting that fictive role as you take maybe your first ventures into the streets as an activist is a really important role. You have to imagine yourself part of a larger community of shared interest. This is what Benedict Anderson would call an imagined community. It's what we call in our research an imagining community, because we want to recognize that as an ongoing process of imagining rather than a fixed product of the imagination. So the community itself imagines together, thinks about transformation together. You have to picture a process of change. How are you going to change society? And you often have to think of feelings of solidarity or empathy for groups whose viewpoints and perspectives differ from your own. And finally, what we take from the Black radical imagination is this idea that you have to imagine equality, freedom, democracy, respect before they have been experienced directly. It's a leap of faith to register the vote in a society which has never allowed you voice before. That's the sort of imagination of Selma, Alabama, say, and of John Lewis, our recently passed civil rights leader. So that active imagination is part of it, and fandom is increasingly recognizing the vital role it plays in building out the imagination and allowing us to think differently about gender, about race, about politics and power and the environment. All of those questions crop up organically in fan fiction writing. The next step out from that is that the infrastructure of fandom provides communication channels and skill building capacity that will enable young activists to move forward. So I've talked to so many young activists who are live streaming protests in the streets for Black Lives Matter, who acquired their skills as skateboarders, recording themselves doing tricks. Or we see people who are writing blogs on political issues who first learned to write and found their voice in public through fan discussion forums. So we're seeing those skills being built out. In the case of K-pop, those skills include technical skills and capacities, because K-pop fans are often involved in a process of shaping the outcome of reality competitions in Korea and elsewhere that are building bands and promoting idols. And so that ability to monitor and shape algorithmically driven mechanisms has led them to everything from registering massive numbers of people for Trump rallies who were not going to turn up, but inflated expectations, to disrupting police attempts to identify protesters in the streets of the various Black Lives Matter marches. So these are young activists who are using technical skills acquired by fandom in order to bring about a changed world. And finally, I would say there's a global network that emerges through fandom that does potentially contribute to global activism. So in the case of K-pop fans and Black Lives Matter, there had been heated debates about race and racial appropriation in K-pop fandom because these Korean performers were appropriating hairstyles, gestures, manners of speech from Black culture in the United States. And particularly Black women as podcasters and bloggers and video bloggers had called them out on that, had educated the community about those issues. So when the Black Lives Matter protest erupted this summer, there were many, many K-pop fans already educated about racial politics in the United States and ready to act on those attitudes and beliefs. So put that all together, and fandom provides a really strong base for that. This summer, I attended the Hermione Granger Academy hosted by the Harry Potter Alliance, and there were more than 200 young activists representing a range of racial and national backgrounds, different causes, who were self-training each other about tactics for social change in a new media environment, but also sustainability for social change. How to bring joy, self-care, empathy into the politics of change within these movements, which are areas that fan-based activism particularly excels at. All right, so enough on that to set us up. I know I'm going long, but let me shift to your other question about what happened last week. I would never say that these participatory culture mechanisms inevitably lead to progressive results. In fact, they can just as easily lead to reactionary results. It's interesting to note that the burning cross used by the American Ku Klux Klan was not a phenomenon in the United States before Birth of a Nation. That Griffith took this imagery from Scotland, applied it in an American context as a fantasy of what the KKK could do. And it has been mimicked by the Klan ever since, making it a form of fan activism and a very egregious form of fan activism. So some people like to talk about Donald Trump as a reality television star, and that's true. But it's interesting, John Hartley has made the argument that reality TV invariably celebrates mechanisms of juries and voting mechanisms, that it's about democracy. But The Apprentice was always from the first a proto-fascist television show, where Trump and Trump alone had the power to make decisions and fire people. Trump also was a celebrity in professional wrestling, where he learned from Vince McMahon and the WWE that making heat, stirring the pot, making people angry was the best way to hold their attention. And so Trump has used that very effectively. And finally, he made his reputation on trash talk television, where again, the mechanism of insult and grievance are mechanisms that are really central. So one of the questions when I think about Trump and Twitter has always been, why does God need a spaceship? Which is a line Kirk uses in one of the Star Trek movies. Why does the President of the United States need to use social media in order to reach his base? It is part of a larger strategy that Trump has had from the very beginning to diminish the role of mainstream media to challenge any notion of truth or accuracy, the power of investigative journalism by calling it all fake news, to delegitimize democratic institutions which might hold his power in check. Recall that in 2016, he refused to answer the question of whether he would accept the results of the election if he lost. You know, from the beginning, he sought to make it hard to hold him accountable for the results of an election. And by using using Twitter in a top-down manner and speaking the language of what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables, the alt-right, the most desperate, by using digital tools to register people to vote who had not ever voted before, but formed the basis for Trump's base, he was able to build up a following that is very strong. So when people talk about this, what happened last week, as a failure of democracy, that's partially true. It is also signs of the success of autocratic mechanisms in using social media in relation to a participatory culture. So yes, what excites me about participatory culture is the broad range of voices that can be heard for the first time. What's dangerous about it is that people have not been socialized into the ethically responsible use of this new power. And the result is that various groups can take advantage of it, trying to reshape access to facts and information, use top-down forces in order to drive action. And this is why I think Trump is more than any other person responsible for what happened last week, not a participatory culture, but a political leadership that is autocratic and that failed to hold Trump responsible. I hold his enablers in the House and the Senate and his cabinet as much responsible for this as anyone else. So yeah, it does illustrate that power of participatory culture and fan activism can work on the right as well as the left, but it demonstrates more than that. And I think we want to hold on to the complexity of that as we now struggle with how can we remain optimistic about the potential of participatory culture in politics, while remaining realistic and pragmatic about the risks and dangers that this particularly illustrates for us.
Thank you so much. I completely agree, but just to follow up on that, do you think that there's a difference between progressive and reactionary fan activism, or are they just the same thing in different directions?
Well, there are differences. I think when we started looking at youth-led political organizations that use new media, for example, it was easy to find them at the left because they were largely decentralized, non-hierarchical political organizations. When we turned to the right, what we saw was that young people typically did not play very active roles in setting the agenda or framing the messages, that there were top-down leadership roles that dominated over those organizations. And I think the same thing would be true if we looked at these kinds of so-called grassroots organizations that participated in the protests. They were much more hierarchical than the kinds of more horizontally structured so-called leaderless networks that we're seeing on the left at the current time. But insofar as they both rely on popular culture, often as the basis for their imagination of what alternatives look like, they are doing somewhat similar things in terms of practices of appropriation and remixing. And so we can't disavow those similarities, even as we look toward some structural differences in the ways those networks operate.
Thank you so much. I want to go back to you just mentioned the decentralizing. So I want to focus on the centralizing of marginalized groups, and also to go back to another text of yours about Star Trek fans and fan fiction that you've also mentioned, in which you address specifically the fandom of women who work to bring to the surface the unwritten feminine countertext, right? That's a quote, the countertext that hides in the margins of the written masculine text. And that specifically was a text about feminist activism of women in many ways. And I think that if we do discuss these marginalized groups that we see in your work and in other fan studies scholars, the fact that there is a specific focus on marginalized groups, whether racial groups or LGBT protests, and as you wrote in By Any Media Necessary about youths, do you see a connection between these marginalized groups, the fact that they're marginalized, and the form of protest? Or is it more in the hands of everyone?
Well, I mean, I would start with the central idea of the Star Trek work, which was that dominant media was not at that time either telling the stories or allowing the voices of minority and women to be heard through the media, and they were not being taken seriously as audiences for media either. So for the female Star Trek fans were surplus viewers in the mean idea of the industry. That is, they were not the dominant audiences, they were add-on audiences. So what they wanted needed to be present, but couldn't be central in the ways that networks thought about that. And I think that's an important part of the story. So these women found things that were in the text, built on it, appropriated, collectively wrote their way through it, and developed new genres, new ways of framing the characters, new ways of expressing their identities, new solidarities through that practice. And that was very, very important to them. At the same time, they were reacting against a male-centered science fiction fandom, a literary fandom, that had been a guy's network for 60 years, that was hostile to them. So some people know the Trekkie-Trekker distinction. Well, what it came out of was the male science fiction fans called these women Trekkies because they said they weren't real science fiction fans. They were simply groupies interested in tearing the clothes off William Shatner. And instead, these women asserted, we are Trekkers, we're active participants in the creation of Star Trek. So we can go over through the years and we can see that network proved to be very important for people, queer people, as more and more of the people I first interviewed for Textual Poachers came out of the closet throughout the 90s and began participating in queer gay pride marches and major cities and have become part of GLBTQT movements today, right? They have been central, and the ability to articulate queer sexualities and the ability of straight women to form solidarity with queer people has proven to be a really central thing. Now, race has been the trouble spot, both for fandom studies. We bracketed it early on, and we shouldn't have. And I think we've come to see the consequences of bracketing race through our work. And people like Rukmini Pandey today are really calling attention to the silences around race. But within fandom itself, it's an ongoing struggle, because the spaces that were created for white women to tell their stories have not been always hospitable to Black women or queer people of color, so forth, as they tell theirs. So that's one way in which I think there's room for improvement. We saw this summer with Black Lives Matter, a group of fans around the world call out Archive of Our Own, which is the major fan fiction website by fans for fans. And the group responded pretty positively to challenges such as to the tagging and disclosure system, which has long tagged sexual violence, but has not tagged themes of racism, racialized violence, slavery in fan fiction. And so there's heated debates going on there. Those of you, to pull it back to the larger frame, those group of people who maybe represent that old school white male science fiction literary fandom today are what often gets labeled as toxic fandom, right? So there was huge backlash within fandom against the new Star Wars films and the ways in which they've had stronger roles for women and characters of color. That's only one part of a larger story. It's the one that the medium news journalism have grabbed hold of. But the flip side of that is the number of attempts by fans to support the diversity and inclusion in Hollywood, to push for more people's voices to be heard through big screen entertainment. And not, whether that's through fan fiction writing contests or cosplay competitions or fan art competitions, fan casting, where people propose actors of color who could play the Marvel superheroes or some other character in popular media. So we're seeing those voices emerge there. So to answer your larger question, fandom does speak for both, but I think fandom is most interesting to me when it speaks on behalf of more disempowered groups, more marginalized groups. And I think it should be more interested to the entertainment industry as well, which is grappling with a legacy of genres that grew out of a period of white supremacy and colonialism, settler mentality, and is searching to tell those stories differently as new voices enter the entertainment system. We will learn more by seeing 1 million fans rewrite those stories in different ways around race than seeing 1 or 2 films a year try to do it. So I think that we're thinking of this as a creative commons, a place where progress and representation can be made, is the most best way to think about what fan fiction is providing the entertainment industry today.
I agree with your notion that it's the most interesting, and I think in terms of our conversation, it's also in many ways the most political, right? Or the form of centralizing the marginalized that has the most political potential. And I think that also takes me to my next question, because you talked about fan fiction as an activist form of participation. And I wanted to ask if you think that there's a connection between fan cultures and fan fiction and of marginalized communities, most specifically, and this increase that we see of independent content in various platforms or web series, digital media, and filmmakers and creators and showrunners that come from marginalized groups of people of color or LGBTQ or marginalized gender communities, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that there's a connection between fandom and creation that kind of finds its new ways into the audience?
I think so. I think, first of all, having a space where fans could create and acquire skills as writers, as media makers, and find an audience at younger and younger ages has empowered more people to think of themselves as creative artists than ever before. So I often say one of the best things about fan fiction is how bad much of it is. Because if you only have the professional and the amateur and no space, then the amateur looks at the professional and says, I'll never get there. But if you read a bad story, you say, I could write a better story. And fan fiction has provided a platform where people can start out bad, get large amount of feedback, improve, maybe get bruised up a little bit, get tougher, develop to the point where they are high quality writers. Whether they choose to go pro or continue to write within the subculture is their choice, but I think that's important. I think that what we've seen is many women writers start out as fan fiction writers today, and they're more and more open about it. It used to be they had to hide that. Post 50 Shades of Grey, when it was outed that had started as a Twilight fan fiction, that moment opened the doors for them to be more open about those connections. I think the ability to build together on text, build solidarity across a generation of creators. There's a really interesting documentary by the filmmaker Sue Ding that's on Netflix about the Babysitters Club books, which had this Asian female character as one of the central figures. And it features all of this generation of writers, comic book creators, filmmakers, Asian women who were inspired by the creativity of this character to think of themselves in different terms and the message the culture was giving them, and have become significant figures in cultural expression today. And I think we could just, everywhere we look, we will find stories like that. Add to that the support mechanism of crowdfunding, right? Or whether it's Patreon or Kickstarter, fans have been very, very effective at putting their money where their mouth is and supporting artists, especially independent artists who are doing work that's sympathetic to the community and its interest. And so I think that's a springboard, again, of financial support for independent media makers that is going to be quite successful. So I know when we think about fandom, we often talk about the power of mass media, but that's simply because the examples that are most visible in the news are examples of mass media fans' successes, because that's what newspaper readers know. But it is not necessarily the only base of support within fandom. Fans support all kinds of media at all kinds of level. And I think independent artists today are learning how to tap their fan base and build relations with them that are allowing for more collective voice and more diverse voices in our culture.
I'll continue with this line of the tension between the institutional and the independent, because I want to challenge a bit more the optimistic notion perhaps, because the context in which you were criticized for being overly optimistic is your seminal text that Professor Neumann mentioned earlier that was just recently translated to Hebrew, Convergence Culture, where all the new media collide, in which you've discussed, again, this democratic potential of participation in transmedia. But I think that some of your criticism was that critics perceived as the depoliticizing the industry's capitalist drive and downplaying the oppressive force of corporations. And you've addressed these criticisms both in later writing, but I think that in many ways, some of this tension is also in the book itself. So this tension between the exploitation of creative industries and the lowering of the role of gatekeepers by the digital world. So if you'd like to kind of expand on this tension, and also if you can speak to the matter in which maybe there's been some change in recent years since you've addressed it recently, in the changes that we see in digital and technological advancements, and also kind of the social and cultural atmosphere.
All right, sure. So I might start by describing what I see as a cycle of work that we can do in cultural studies in response to social and technological change. Because I think we often get stuck in one stage, that of critique, and don't explore the full menu of possible responses we might have. So first for me is a stage of analysis in which we identify current situations, map them out, understand what's going on as clearly as possible. Second comes critique, where we identify problems or difficulties in those conditions that need to be addressed. Third is what I call advocacy, which is where you identify alternatives, some purely imaginary, some already visible, and document them so we have a clear picture of what steps forward could look like and what is already taking place. And fourth is intervention, where we partner with other kinds of segments of the society to try to implement what we see as more viable policies. Now, to me, a lot of cultural studies work gets stuck at critique. And so we have a very clear sense of what these writers are against, but don't have a very clear sense of what they're for. And I think that's where my work intervenes, that I tend to work on those latter two steps. I do analysis, sure. I ground in a sense of what's going on at the current time. And then I seek to find examples where people are demonstrating the potentials of this emerging space, which is what gets me called an optimist more often than not, because I'm not necessarily celebrating, but I'm demonstrating the capacities for other possibilities. And then third, more recently, my work has been in a very strongly an interventionist stage. And I think we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. So when I go back to convergence culture, I'm documenting something that is still emerging. I'm writing at a moment where even the term Web 2.0 hasn't been coined yet. I'm looking at what is still mostly an entrepreneur-based digital economy that has not yet concentrated into the large-scale corporate system that we're looking at a time when many of my critics on the left also were arguing we had to break up the power of big media and enable small companies to move in. So I'm describing small companies. By the time the book comes out, a year and a half after I wrote it, by the time 2 or 3 years later, the first critiques come out, the situation has changed pretty fundamentally in terms of what the structure of ownership is. And I would agree with many of those critiques from the vantage point they're written at, but not from the vantage point where I was writing. I think there's a difference in time we have to hold on to. So yes, my book, The Convergence Culture, is perhaps overly optimistic about the possibility for economic change, for bottom-up change to disrupt corporate culture. I think at the time they were overly pessimistic about the idea of concentrated media completely eradicating difference within our culture and making it impossible for people to speak back. So we were both wrong in the assessments we were making at that moment in time. I do think that convergence culture shows that tension, as you say, where I always signal some of the challenges or critiques, but it's not where I put most of my energy. I'm counterbalancing other writers in the field, and I'm counting on those writers to continue to do their work. So someone like Mark Andreevich does a very good job of raising the challenges of this new digital environment without totally foreclosing the kinds of participatory culture work that I write about. And there are so many others like that. Sarah Bene Weiser comes to mind as someone that I see myself engaged with, but we often emphasize a different aspect of the same phenomenon.
So you were saying that you were both wrong in terms of the prophecy of what would happen, but you were both right in terms of both these trajectories staying in tension and still do?
Yes, I mean, that's where the book
than the other?
began. I was seeing my friends at the MIT Media Lab talk about how we were moving toward a world where mass media would wither away and there would be no more gatekeepers because of new media. And I said, that sounded a bit right. And then I was hearing other people, you know, Robert McChesney talk about the concentration of media into 4 or 5 companies was a danger to American democracy. And that seemed right to me. So I wrote a book which was about the interplay between those two forces. I just played more emphasis on the new than maybe I should have in writing that book. And people lost track of the fact that all the examples in that book were mass media phenomena owned by major corporations. I was not undermining the idea that mass media has power, only that it doesn't have absolute power, and that we're gaining new technologies, platforms, practices, which enabled other power, bottom-up power, to exert itself in the communication process.
Thank you. This was fascinating. I want to take it a little bit further and ask, we've seen how the effects of the pandemic on media production and consumption have shifted things, both in terms of how they're produced and both in terms of how audiences consume media. And I wanted to ask you if you think that these changes could also impact democratic or political activism of both fans and different forms of participation.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at the last year, a number of things happened in the mediascape. One was that a major mass media was more or less put out of commission for a solid year, that is cinema, right? What if you dimmed those lights and brought up the lights on various forms of participatory culture? For example, Twitch, and the emergence of Twitch as a platform that now even national political leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had a rally on Twitch just before the election, which brought together more people than any of Trump's rallies had ever brought together before. But all young people interested in video games to watch the Congresswoman play video games and talk to them about the future of the environment and democracy. There's some incredible things this past year taking place on Twitch. The increased visibility of podcasting as a platform, and not just the corporate podcast, but grassroots podcasts continuing to grow as an influence in our culture. The lowering of the technical standards of Hollywood, particularly television technical standards, which have always been its big advantage in the global marketplace. Couple that with something like Netflix attracting content from around the world into a centralized portal. There's now the potential, and we've seen it start to be realized in the last year, of international content starting to outperform American content in the US marketplace. So all of those things suggest some major disruptions in the last year of the communication landscape. And as all of that is taking place, we have seen major growth and activism, some of the highest participation in the US election ever, especially among young people, among voters of color, and mobilizing in new ways. We've seen the huge scale of protest across America for Black Lives Matter this summer and leading into the fall. We've seen Greta lead this global environmental justice movement in new ways, and we're seeing global networking take place. Even something as basic as this, where I'm speaking to you from the US, you're listening to me from Israel, but probably from other parts of the world as we speak. This organizational capacity that Zoom represents is not something we recognized. We may have had it in some forms before this pandemic, but we're only really recognizing this potential to come together to deliberate in real time and on the scale as a result of Zoom's impact on our lives today. So I put all that together, and I think this has proven to be an important year for thinking about grassroots media power. Now, does that mean that corporate power doesn't count? No, Disney owns large shares of the public imagination around the world. Even if it had a year without Marvel, that we have, Netflix sends concentration of power, and Netflix and Disney Plus and the other streaming platforms is really scary coming out of this past year, because the broadcast networks and even the cable networks had relatively little new content coming out over the past year. So they dominated the marketplace, and those networks won't get that back. So we're seeing this as a huge year for media concentration as well. And again, that tension I'm describing between those two phenomena persists coming through 2020 and into 2021.
I think you've added into the tension between independent voices and more institutional voices, what you've discussed about this kind of blurring of global boundaries, right? That we talk from different parts of the world, and many texts that are not Western become more popular through Netflix or other platforms. So that kind of connects me to what you've said in the past, that you see a need to de-Westernize fan studies. So do you see a connection between maybe a desire to de-Westernize the scholarship with what is happening throughout the world during this past year? A de-Westernization perhaps of media content?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's really urgent. I would say still most work in fandom studies is in the Anglo-American world, the British Commonwealth maybe. More of it is in Asia and East Asia in particular than any place else. But work in Eastern Europe, work in the Middle East, work in Africa, work in Latin America still urgently needs to be done. And it represents a blind spot for many of us, which is not to say that fans aren't connecting across those axes. They are. But understanding the local practices of fandom, understanding the international interfaces of fandom, is work that only a small number of people have started to do. And I think that's a really urgent thing for us to think about. I think also there's a need for partnerships. So one of the ways that been dramatically brought to my attention this year was over the summer, the Chinese government shut down Archive of Our Own, which I described earlier as an important fan fiction archiving site. It's a site that won a Hugo Award for its contributions to science fiction culture. It was shut down because there was a fight around rival fan groups around a particular Chinese idol, a star in a telenovela series, and the government sided with the more repressive of that fan group and shut it down. I was called by the Chinese press to comment on this and put it into context because I just published an article in Archive of Our Own. And when I reached out to the Chinese scholars I knew there who were studying fandom, they all felt they were not in a position to be able to speak, but were deeply appreciative of American scholars and scholars elsewhere speaking out on their behalf, because of the context of the government repression. So I spent a fair amount of time this summer trying to do that. But as I did so, I more and more came to realize how little we still knew about fandom in China. To try to sort out the complexities of the dynamic there was beyond my knowledge and capacity as a scholar. And I had not been to China in a decade. So I didn't have the grounding that I needed to really be effective. I could explain how Archive of Our Own worked and how it worked in the American context. But the Chinese media kept wanting me to explain how it worked in a Chinese context. And I always refused to do that kind of work because I don't have the same grounded knowledge of other cultures as I have of my own. And I don't want to fall in the American trap of getting off an airplane and immediately telling another country how to conduct their affairs. So, but I think it brought home to me just how much more work needs to be done, what a stronger partnership needs to be built, and how much more insight we need to learn from each other as we confront some global situations where fandom is concerned.
I think what you've told taps into the way that you kind of you work in all these fields. You call yourself an ACA fan, right? An academic fan, because you're both a fan and an academic. And in many ways, what you do is the story you've just told is political. So I wanted to take that story and ask what you see, both academia and media, and what they can do to, you recently discussed the fact that in terms of the criticism that you've received about being overly optimistic, that you don't want to mention participatory culture as a closed text, but you're talking about a push toward a more participatory culture. So can you talk about the way that academia and media can work toward this more participatory culture? What can be done to include those who are still excluded, like you've discussed, both in the world at large, but also economically or technologically, culturally?
Yeah, I mean, I think academia gives us a bully pulpit, to use a very American expression. It is a space where we speak out and have a privilege of being heard with varying degrees. And American academics don't get a lot of press in their own country. We do a little better when we're overseas. But I think that in general, there is platforms that we can have that exist or we can open up. For me, the primary platforms have been the blog and now the podcast as platforms I use. And I use them not just to amplify my own voice, but one of the things we as senior academics can do is to amplify the voice of other scholars, both globally. Within the US, I work on bringing up younger voices, voices of people of color, women's voices, and we really try to amplify them through our podcast, through the blog, and ensure that those perspectives get heard in those conversations. Our job, our capacity to convene conversations like conferences and panels to bring people together who would not normally be talking to each other. And this is something during this period of prolonged media change, I think has become particularly important, is all kinds of people are talking about media, but not to each other, whether they're policymakers or journalists or educators or activists or artists, bringing those groups together to have discussions which allow those perspectives to mix and match, right? To find new partnerships. And that, I think, is an essential part of the way I approach doing academic work. I think I have a deep commitment to education, and in particular media literacy education. And I think that's a central tool of ensuring through schools that more young people have access to the skills they're going to need, not just technical skills, but social and cultural skills to meaningfully participate in the central conversations of their culture. I think it involves helping people to appreciate the power they do have, as well as the limits on that power. And that's part of the challenge of a cultural studies based entirely on critique, is it's often disempowering. It tells people very pessimistically, what I call critical pessimism, that the battle's already been lost. It is inevitably that corporate power will rule over us, and there's nothing we can do with it. And so I do not understand how you can have a politics without agency, how you can imagine social change without the capacity of people to change things, or how you can speak truth to power if you're not speaking to the people in power. So in all of those ways, I think an intervention-based approach that bridges between different groups in the culture is a good way for us to move forward in confronting the challenges of a participatory culture. The more I do that, the more it's clear how many challenges there are on how many different fronts, whether it's corporate constraints on intellectual property or media policies that affect access to education and technology, to the educational challenges. Just across the board, there are problems affecting our ability to participate. And on the other side, ethical norms. How do communities regulate their own behavior so that participation does not become a tool to silence other people's participation, is a central question. So Nico Carpentier and I had a good discussion a year or so back on the blog about the ethics of participation. And it's an idea that we're starting to build on for a new piece now. So I think all of that is part of a struggle to use academic power in order to broaden what voices are heard in the culture and to ensure conditions for more democratic participation and collective agency, which are, to me, the central struggles I've dedicated my work to.
And also, as you say, you use that both in your teaching and your mentorship, right? You discussed earlier about the Civic Imaginations Project that kind of taps into this connection between mentorship and activism and media. And this,
so I think the Civic Imagination Project at any given moment in time has 10 to 15 PhD candidates from Annenberg and from other parts of USC who are thinking partners. We agree to work together to do research, to publish, to develop things. So the book Popular Culture and the Civic Imagination grew out of the collective editorship of that entire research group. It features, I forget, 13, 14 of our current or former PhD students in the collection, but those students also helped us frame the collection, identify contributors, work with contributors at every stage of the editorial process. And along that way, we're mentoring them into doing editorial work for the future. And we've already been existed now for more than a decade. So a number of academic stars have come out of that program and have gone on to do their own research agendas on participatory politics, including Neda Kligla-Vilicek there in Israel, who was one of the very founding members of the Civic Paths group. So that's an important dimension of the work. That group in turn both tracks contemporary trends in politics, activism, and popular culture, the sort we've been talking about, but also we're doing on the ground works with community groups of all types to help build workshops for the civic imagination. And our second book, Practicing Futures, which is edited by Sangeeta Shrestova, that book has just come out also and is a how-to guide to conduct these workshops. We've done them both in red states and blue states in the US. We've done it with everyone from senior citizens to middle school students, trying to do workshops where we imagine futures together and use that as an occasion for people to come together and explore shared hopes, aspirations, frustrations, problems, to talk through things and to be a springboard on the ground for community organizers to work with those populations to bring about interventions that affect their work. We've now done 60, 70 out of our group, and there was another 60 done in Pakistan by a research team there. And we're eagerly seeking other research partners around the world to take that process further. And so we can have a global sense of how people think about the civic and the political and the future together.
And it seems like this project connects all the things that we've talked about, the imagining communities and the centralizing of the marginalized and the de-Westernization. So I want to take you to, and this would be my final question, and then we can take some questions from the audience who can put them in the Q&A box. Because I wanted to also address another position of yours that's also been subject to some criticism. That's your work with the industry, right? That also kind of places you in the middle of this tension between the media corporates and individual independent creators. But I do remember I saw an interview with you that you've said that you never feel as politically radical as when you're standing in a corporate boardroom, because you see that they want you to talk and challenge them. So if you want to talk a bit more about what you do in the industry and how political it is and how it takes media in a political and protest way.
Sure. I mean, my interest in this started when I went to Australia quite early on in my academic career. And I saw there all these Australian intellectuals who were, first of all, on regular basis with talk show hosts in their country, talking through the media on a regular basis, and an inspiration for what a public intellectual would look like, but also consulting with their government, including governments that they were sharply opposing to, on cultural policy, right? It's not that they agreed with every position of the government, but they knew it was important to intervene in key debates, and that talking to those people was better than throwing journal articles at them from the sideline, right? So when I came back and I started looking at where is cultural policy set in the United States, and the situation in Israel is somewhat different. It's closer probably to Australia than the United States in terms of national governmental policies around culture. But in America, cultural policy making is incredibly weak. The policies that affect everyday life for people is shaped by corporations, and it's terms of service, and it's privacy issues, and it's copyright policies, and it's how the decisions get made about what culture gets produced. Those decisions, which affect our culture in very profound ways, are made in corporate boardrooms. And so when the first invitation came for me to speak to a corporation, I jumped at it, right? Because I felt like this was a space, my voice needed to be heard. The perspectives I represented, which are not profit driven, but are about the connection of the industry to the public, were important to be heard inside those boardrooms. And what often happens when I speak and address their questions is that people come padding up after me. Junior executives come up and say, I've been trying to convince my boss to make that change for a long time. He'd never listened to me, but he'd listened to an academic who would make those recommendations. And indeed, I've seen policy shift within those companies. So yeah, it does sometimes feel radical or political to be in that space talking. I'm not trying to tell them how to make money. I'm also not trying to tell them how to lose money. I'm trying to tell them that they might be able to make money and be more of a public agent that embraces the participatory culture that seems so important to me on so many levels. Increasingly now I'm talking to them about how to build on what we learn about the civic imagination, to make more responsible choices about how political processes or community life are represented on the screen, if those are going to be the metaphors people use to construct their political identities from. So that's the kind of work that I'm doing there. And I think it's important work. Go back to what I said earlier, you can't talk truth to power unless you're talking to people who have power. And so getting in those rooms, having this, be in the room where it happens, as Hamilton would say, those moments are really important for the field. And I've been able to open that space for many other younger scholars whose voices are urgently need to be heard within that industry space. And we've done conferences which bring industry voices into academia so that our students can see them. When we do that, we videotape them and put them out on the web so people around the world can hear corporate leaders talk about some of the controversial positions they've taken and some of the issues affecting the relations between audience and industry.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating, and I'm sure that we have some very interesting questions from the audience, and we already have some. But I want to first maybe see if Professor Neumann would like to join us and make a comment, and then we can turn to some questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really illuminating. As you were talking, I was thinking constantly about the relationship between cooperation and academia, because it's been really extensive debates here also in Israel about the relationship between academia and the industry, and the freedom of academic expression in relation to the media and how they are supposed to work together. Because on the one hand, also in academia, we are bound and we are forced to work in economical circumstances, because we are especially in public universities on the one hand, but then on the other hand, so the connection to the so to speak real life has to be negotiated. And this can it involves many hazards that that might affect freedom of speech, freedom of expression. We've seen only in the last week, the High Supreme Court banned one of the films made by an Israeli-Palestinian filmmaker, that his film is not allowed to be showed in Israel. So it becomes really delicate, especially, and as you elaborated, I thought, the ways in which, we are supposed to be the safeguards of freedom of expression and culture in order to advance and capitalize on the new means of media in order to advance society and protect democracy. So it resonated a lot of things that unfortunately we're seeing here in Israel. And, I think in that respect, Israel is very much, parallel to the US and the things that, and the processes that we're seeing unfolding in America. But again, I think it's very important what you've said, and thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it's very important that we negotiate our own relationships to industry that do not involve signing over control over our intellectual property and silencing our voices. And to me, that was another reason to get into those dialogues early on, was not to inherit provisions for relating to industry that grew out of corporate relations to business schools or technology schools, but reflected the kinds of expertise that humanists and social scientists might bring to those conversations. But yeah, I think we're all struggling with these questions.
Right.
Government funding comes with its own restrictions, so does corporate funding. Somehow we've got to navigate a path between those two worlds in order to maintain academic freedom and independence to do the work that's important for us to do during this time of change. And I'll say I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. I don't think I've sold my soul to the company store, but I do think that there are moments where I was naive and too trusting in relations. And there are moments where, I ended up regretting arrangements that got signed as we were working through what these new relationships would look like.
And how is it?
I try to make that information available to people.
Sure.
So that we can actually all learn from my mistakes and not repeat them. But it's, when you're bleeding edge, you're going to make some bad calls now and again.
And I guess it's especially more difficult or more complex when you are dealing with such a strong industry as, as the film industry in Hollywood and in Southern California, which, I guess they're trying also to have their own impact on what's going on within academia on the one hand. And then on the other hand, the academic life within this region is looking up to Hollywood becoming part of it, because you have students that I believe would want to become, great filmmakers and have opportunities to produce their dreams. And you have there an industry that, that will be able to fulfill their dreams. So this might goes both ways.
And I think there's advantage of helping to train our students to go into those industries with a critical consciousness and an awareness of the kinds of issues that we in communications teach. And I've had great luck in placing students from the master's program I created at MIT and my master's students at USC in key decision-making places affecting crowdfunding, the games industry and harassment issues. Any number of times I could point to specific cases where students I helped to train have been leaders in making ethical decisions inside corporate spaces. And I think we can do that as long as we don't wash our hands and say, we're pure of any influence of industry or any conversation with industry. We're going to keep this as a, purely, safe zone for progressive politics and not a lot else. And I think that that's finding the way to be progressive and engage with corporations is something that we as faculty members have to put some attention to.
Right.
And I think we keep going back to this tension. This is I think we all battle with this tension that is always coming to us. Thank you so much. We do have some time for some questions from the audience, and you can keep asking questions in the Q&A box. But the first question is from Neta Kligler-Vilenchik, who you've mentioned, that was your PhD student. And she asks, to what extent has the ability of protesters to narrate and present their own efforts through social media shaped the mainstream media coverage of protesters and protests?
I think it's been important. And as the book that Neta and I and Sangeeta and Relly Zimmerman and Liana Gambler-Thompson wrote together, called By Any Media Necessary, youth activism, tells us partially through the story of the Dreamer movement in the United States, where young people were going on YouTube and coming out as undocumented at a time when that was and still is a very risky thing to do, because it increases the focus on you and therefore the likelihood that you might be deported. At a certain scale of visibility, people were telling us, it decreased the likelihood of deportation because the visibility would mean a ripple effect through the conversation. We also there talk about young American Muslim who were telling their own story on YouTube. And we're seeing in the last 2 election cycles, some of the young activists that we foregrounded there are now on mainstream news channels and CNN and even Fox, telling their own stories about the political events, helping to frame the way political events have been understood. So the more Trump went after Muslims with his Muslim ban, the more he's fought to build the wall. It has provided a platform where the voices of dreamers are heard more and more. The voices of American Muslim youth are being heard more and more. And I think we saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen that with the environmental justice movement, that the ability to get signals out, to put them out on those channels, shapes the message and the way those messages are heard by mainstream media. You know, Nico Carpentier has this distinction of politics in media and politics through media, right? So politics in media is Fox News' capacity to totally ignore the Occupy movement. Politics through media is the millions of videos posted on YouTube by Occupy protesters. They're both corporately owned channels, but one model allows those voices to be heard and to start to influence mainstream messaging, whereas the other simply shuts them down. So there's no question I'd much rather live in a world where those voices are amplified by mainstream media, but are available to anyone who wants to trace them using participatory media channels, than one that simply has strong gatekeepers and no access to the means of communication.
Then we also have a responsibility as viewers to choose the platform from which we consume these messages.
Yeah, so participation for me is not just making media, but it is also the circulation of media. And that's a central theme in the book that I wrote with Sam Ford and Joshua Green, Spreadable Media, because there where we're describing circulation as that grassroots hybrid communication network where we each are passing along pieces of media that are meaningful to us, to conversations of groups of people we care about, where they make sense as part of the content for that conversation. And so it's not just that the videos are laying there on YouTube as a dead archive. It's that people are actively circulating them, including circulating them to people in the media industries, that results in those messages getting further amplified by mass media networks of one sort or another. So we have responsibility to spread messages that matter to us. We also should have accountability for the quality of information we put out there, both its accuracy and its civility of information we put out. And that means holding ourselves accountable, holding each other accountable for the quality of information that's put into circulation. Because without that, then participatory channels just become totally polluted with misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and so forth. And short of regulation, which potentially threatens the very freedoms to participate that we're trying to celebrate here, we've got to build collective systems of ethics and accountability that ensure the quality of interaction in those systems. And we've seen what happens, how bad things can get if we don't work together to build those sets of norms and ethical commitments to each other.
I think that really connects to the next question that we have from the audience by Aguinaldo Melo, who asks, what you think is our biggest flaw as a society in our media literacy education or lack thereof?
Well, I think media literacy education has gone through multiple waves. The first wave was about critical consumption, that is parsing messages, thinking about them. The second wave added to that critical production, that is the capacity to make media. But globally, media literacy education has to make that third step and focus on media participation. And that's where this discussion about accuracy, accountability, civility, ethical norms, group behavior has to enter into it. It's not enough to be critics of existing media messages. It's not enough to know how to pick up a camera and make media. We all live in a constantly mediated culture, and navigating that, participating in that is really central to what it is to have media skills for the 21st century. And that's where, as much as anything, things have started to break down over the last decade or two as the growth of digital media has gone, unchecked. It is more and more people are participating, but the sense of what it is to participate and what are the ethical obligations of a participant, how do we learn to listen as well as to speak, say, those are questions that aren't addressed very often because we're still locked into this suspicion-based model, a critique-based model, and not a model that's advocating for new kinds of behavior that we're not yet witnessing in the world, but need to exist for the world we're moving toward to function more effectively on behalf of everyone's interest.
We have a question from Norma Drimmer, who goes back to your discussion about ethics and participation. And she wants to know, how would you propose to have ethic norms established once you have them to prevent groups from becoming a tool of repression when they probably will not accept those ethic norms?
Yeah, I think this is not a simple question, and I don't know that I have the answers. My method would say you look at those spaces which do seem to have functioning systems of ethical norms and go from there. And I would point to what I see as the two biggest landmarks of participatory culture in the current networked era. One of them is Wikipedia, the other is Archive of Our Own, right? And those are two massive scale enterprises that the leadership of have put a deep commitment to how to resolve conflicts, how to ensure a balance of power and interest, how to ensure the quality and integrity of what is there. In Wikipedia's case, it is establishing a set of norms for adjudicating conflict around what does and doesn't belong in Wikipedia. And we can debate those norms and rules, but we can see that they work most of the time. And when errors come into Wikipedia, and it's easy to pick on Wikipedia for errors, they're temporary, they're short-lived, and are resolved frequently by the Wikipedian community having a deep commitment to those norms, coming in and addressing them. And there's nothing monopolistic about Wikipedia. There are advantages to participating in Wikipedia over starting your own encyclopedia, but no one's excluded from putting information on the web. Only if you want to be in Wikipedia and contribute to Wikipedia, you follow those rules and norms. With the Archive of Our Own, it's a system of self-disclosure, trigger warnings, and tagging that are designed to signal to people what's in your story so that they can decide if they want to read it or not. It's not about censorship of stories on Archive of Our Own. The stories are there, but it is a space where if you are triggered by themes of sexual violence, you should know going into reading that story that that theme is there and is dealt with in some ways. If you don't want queer content, you should know it's there. Conversely, if you're looking for queer content, you can know that it's there, right? Those tags are designed to help people find what they want to engage with and to avoid content that might be problematic. Now, the debate this summer about racism on the site is more tricky because no one is going to say, yes, I have racist content in my story, right? That's people who are racist don't self-identify from racist except on the extremes. And therefore, it's creating a challenge that community is trying to work through as we speak. But I think that they're doing so with an openness that I rarely see in discussions of race and racism elsewhere in the culture. I think that they have created an environment where that community is willing to talk through those issues and find solutions as most practical solutions they can for addressing those concerns and broaden who gets to participate in that culture. So I think though, I would be studying those kinds of sites and see what's working, because neither of those are small scale. Those are large scale communities, but they're not as big as the web as a whole. And so, the web as a whole creates its own challenges of different national contexts, political, ideological, spiritual traditions, which are going to shape ethical norms. And I don't know if anyone has ever created ethical norms that held on a global scale, like as would be required for us to really deal with the World Wide Web in its entirety. The best we can do right now is look for specific communities and have those debates there, and then see if we can build outward from the insights that we get from success stories.
Also going back to protests, Moshe Karabelnik asks, what do you think about the power of mobile phone images produced by social activists and distributed on social media to create symbolic capital and change the media discourse, especially when compared to activist writing?
Well, I think it was very important this summer during the Black Lives Matter protest. I live in downtown Los Angeles most of the time. My apartment building at one point had the National Guard on one side rallying to begin to move in, the protesters marching down the street on the other side, and 5 police helicopters hovering overhead of the building all night long. And almost none of that was on the television news for Los Angeles. So I was following what was happening right outside my window, literally, by reading the mobile phone and following the Twitters, the live streams, the downloaded video footage, the uploaded video footage, the uploaded images from the street protesters to get a sense of what was actually taking place in my own neighborhood. And this is a case where we can't necessarily trust mass media reporters to report on resistance movements of all sorts inside our community. Most of what we now know, storm of the Capitol came the same way. That in that case, photographs taken by the people occupying the Capitol are now being used as evidence to convict them for crimes that they committed while inside the Capitol. It's a very complex situation. And we're now hearing that representatives, Republican representatives, were texting with the protesters while they were in the building, giving them encouragement of various sorts. And that's going to come back and affect the political fortunes of those politicians, I hope. But that's taking place and through this sort of social media context which the news media itself was largely locked outside and couldn't cover what was taking place there. So those things are important, and individual images from that can be solidified into something that speaks more loudly. Memes are a great way of taking an image or an issue and just making it something that spreads across the culture and has an impact and becomes part of the historical memory. When I wrote Convergence Culture, there's a passage in there that I talk about democracy, democracy through, I've even forgotten the term that I used. But anyway, I was describing this process as the people's editorial cartoons. This was at a moment where memes it wasn't yet being used to refer to what it means today, but we were already, Photoshop for Democracy is what that chapter was called, right? So the idea of manipulating images for political purposes. And that is a street level version of the editorial cartoons that we've all grown up seeing in our history textbooks as representative of public opinion at particular moments in time. I think the future memes will be doing that purpose for us. And I think some of those photographs by street photographers are going to be really central to the way the future understands the history of the political movements of the 21st century. And I think they're central now to the way the public makes sense of Occupy, of Dreamers, of Black Lives Matter, of environmental justice, of the Arab Springs, any of the kind of protest movements of the last couple of decades.
I think this change in the forms of media and modes of address keeps on shifting how the messages are transferred. And this also connects to Professor Anat Zangel's question from the Tisch School of Film and Television here at Tel Aviv University. And she asks about the relation between video games and cinema, and if you see this connection related to the future of cinema.
Well, I definitely do, and I think it's been there for a long time. I would go back to something like Run Lola Run, which I taught in the late 90s, early 2000s. I forget exactly which year that film came out, but as a film that was very much meant to be consumed as a video game, which shows the same events unfold 3 times. And each time you want to see if you can improve your score and get further into the game as you watch that movie. I mean, all of the metaphors running through that film were video game metaphors. The Korean popular cinema for the last 20 years has been shaped by filmmakers who think about video game aesthetics. There's a great moment in Old Boy where we basically see a guy fighting his way through a whole layer of bosses that's shot in a really extreme, long, bar-shaped frame to look just like a level in a video game. So I think we're seeing that, and I think we're seeing with that expectations of multiplicity of point of view, of variability of outcome, of nonlinearity, all of which are very important. At the same time, I think that video game aesthetic is also affecting protest. I had a student this semester write about Hong Kong and the degree to which the Hong Kong students in the democracy movement there were posting guides, tip sheets and guides for video games that didn't exist, using them to mask the actual tactics they were educating each other in and how to battle the police and maintain their protest marches in the streets of Hong Kong. In mainland China, there have been massive scale protests, anonymous protests, inside massive multiplayer games where people couldn't take to the streets safely, but wanted to register the scale of discontent with governmental policies. And those are just two examples worldwide of the way the video game technology is being used by activists to rally, to organize, to educate, and prepare for real street protest or to conduct protest in an online space to ensure the safety of the participants.
We have a final question, a fascinating question about the identity of the scholar by Holly Rowland, who would like to know one of the main critiques of theories on accelerationism is the pressure it puts on the left to provide their perhaps utopic vision of the future, while the right has no problem doing so to an extreme. I am inspired, she says, by your optimism, but how can I, a white British scholar, begin to best make those strides of representing ideas from new voices without falling foul of criticisms of white knighting subjects I perhaps don't have a base for, as you mentioned earlier in the current pandemic, while also keeping up with the acceleration of culture in the academy?
Well, I think the first thing is you don't do it on your own. I mean, I think when we're having these conversations, they have to actually be conversations. I try not to speak for other people in my writing. That's one reason why I do ethnography, is to incorporate those voices in their own terms into my writing and hear and have those conversations in the field. Most of my ethnographic writing gets sent back to the research subjects I talk to, and they critique it before I publish it. So I'm a great believer in nothing about us without us as a kind of core philosophy of working with groups of all kinds. I think it's also true, it's also true that you want to mobilize those voices. One reason I started the podcast was to create a space where I engaged with a variety of groups in a very transparent way, brought forward scholars and activists and artists who represented backgrounds and perspectives different from my own, but engaged with them in conversation so I can learn, my listeners can learn, and I can use my status and visibility to amplify voices that might not get heard otherwise. I don't mean that in a white savior or noblesse oblige way, simply as modestly as we can, we need to use whatever power we have to broaden what voices get heard and what perspectives get listened to. And as a white male, American male, Southern-born American male, raised in the Jim Crow era, I feel a particular obligation to listen right now as much or more than I speak. But in speaking, where I have a chance to speak, amplify what I've heard and what I've learned from these other groups, and do so with as a kind of theoretical language that may be heard by an academic group, or in a different kind of language that may be heard by a business group or a group of secondary school teachers or whatever other group that I'm talking to at a given moment. So I see my work as bridge building within that space, because now I've gone out and I've listened to everything from coal miners and tobacco farmers in Kentucky to sex workers in Los Angeles talk about their imagined futures. I do have some visions of what a variety of groups want to think about an ideal future society could do and what the shared principles we hear across that. And that's helped me to articulate more fully my own utopian instincts in terms of what I think a more just, equitable society would look like as it affects media and communication practices.
Thank you so much, Professor Jenkins. I think this is a great note to end with, this tie between politics and academia and media, I want to thank you again very much for agreeing to be our guest, and we've all enjoyed your wisdom and experience with these issues. So I would like to, on behalf of the faculty and our guests, thank you again, and I'm sure that Professor Neumann would like to thank you as well.
Thank you also. I would like to also extend join the thanks, Yael's thanks, and extend my invitation for you to come here whenever times allows, and we hope to have you and see you face to face. Thank you for the last hour. I definitely built some bridges, and as you're always constantly doing, globally. So we were very thankful for that, and we hope to see you soon with us. So
I hope to be there soon too. It has been great exchanging ideas with you.
Thank you very much. Take care, and thanks for everybody for joining us to this event, wherever you are, and see you in the next event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.